right, well, welcome everyone to the Leadership for Society series, Race and Power. It's my pleasure today to have with us Professor Mehrsa Baradaran. She's a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCL Law School. She writes about banking law, financial inclusion, and racial inequality, and is the author of How the Other Half Banks and The Color of Money. So welcome, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor.
Yeah. So I told you when we had a quick conversation prior to this that I was gonna say that you pulled the bait and switch with this book. So it's about Black banking, but reading through the book, there's a lot more than Black banking. That seems to be even a side part of the book. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this and how the book came about?
Yeah, I wanted to use actually Black banking to debunk this, Black banking and at first immigrant banking to debunk this general theory and sort of policy that you see in banking, which is that, for the big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, they're kind of tied in with the Fed and the monetary policy and all that stuff kind of works in a very, integrated form with the government. And then when it comes to, racial equity or inequality in general, communities are always told, oh, well, you should rely on microcredit or community banking or, credit unions. Like, in other words, that the money creation mechanism is going to be, everyone's just going to put their deposits in a bank and that's going to multiply money. And those who understand sort of in banking know that that's not how wealth is created. It's really, through, the money multiplier being an integrated whole into the banking process. And then, getting those subsidies and guarantees from the Fed and Treasury. And so I wanted to use Black banks to actually just show the myth in general and really talk about banking. And as I started researching Black banks, it was never going to be just about Black banks. It was always going to be to say something about banking, but really the book turned into, as I started digging around in the materials, it turned into much more of a political story and more, I think, dark and cynical than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be, oh, well, I'm going to use this thing that happened on the side here to show my main point. And really it's about, oh, well, this industry was used to subvert these actual claims for justice. And it ends up becoming about the racial wealth gap, really.
Mm-hmm. And you start actually further back than that, right? So you talk about the roots of kind of American capitalism and slavery. So you can tell us a little bit about where you start so you can give us a kind of a ground to move from?
Yeah, so, slavery, the wealth creation from slavery, I think, it's not just the labor of the property in men and women, right? So it's not just that slaves are growing cotton and it's cheap to have cotton produced by slaves because you're not paying for, wages. It is also that property man and the ownership of humans was collateral, was capital that you can then use to grow that wealth. So the entire Southern economy, and the caveat is that it wasn't just the Southern economy, it was the Northern economy and the Liverpool, sort of the worldwide cotton trade, used not just the labor that the slavery produced, but also the capital that slavery produced to sort of spin the wheels of this capitalist system to create cotton to feed into the Liverpool merchants and the Northern industrialists, and to kind of create a currency based on the slaves themselves. And so that really is the point at, during Reconstruction where, so we obviously, Civil War to end slavery. During Reconstruction, there was this real fear that by the North and the Liverpool merchants, that if the freedmen got land, which was always the point, that was always what was going to happen in the Freedmen's Bureau bill, because what else was the point of having Reconstruction? We've had like treasonous Confederate Southerners, right? So the options were like off with their heads, or, you repartition the land. And when that was being discussed, the traders in the North and in the Liverpool sort of cotton importers started freaking out, because in Haiti, when the freed slaves got land, they grew subsistence crops, because that's what you do when you have land. You grow a part of your plot to feed your family, and then you grow a little bit of cash crop. But if everyone stops growing the cash crop, the prices go up, right? Demand goes down, supply goes down, demand goes up, prices go up. And the worldwide sort of cotton markets did not want that to happen. And so for that to not happen, you couldn't get land. And that's how the 40 acres promise was eradicated. And then instead they got a bank, right? The Freedmen's Bank. And I start with that story and talk about the subversion of the land grant being about the demands of capital.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you brought up Haiti, it's interesting, because I always thought of the biggest issue with Haiti was the fear of a revolt, because they weren't actually freed, right? They freed themselves through violent revolt, and I assume that was the bigger kind of driver of response to that revolution. But it's interesting that you're talking about it in terms of the concern about, right, the kind of crops that would be raised, right, moving from I guess sugar primarily in Haiti to now more subsistence crops, and they were worried about that in the South.
Oh, they were definitely worried about the violence as well. I mean, the revolt. Yeah. That's not to minimize that, but post Reconstruction, these are the worries of the Liverpool merchants, not the Southerners themselves. This becomes what are the capitalists worried about? Of course, the Southerner. I mean, the threat of rebellion was ever present in slavery and post slavery, and that's where you get the incredible violence post Reconstruction. But during Reconstruction, in the moment where there was a chance to have land allocation and to have real power, this is where the North and because the story gets told is like, oh well, the Northern Republicans just like lost interest, and it wasn't that they lost interest. It was that they really needed this demand for low price cotton.
Can you tell us a little bit about Reconstruction? I think I've used that term in other conversations, and I'm not sure that everyone is up to speed about when we say Reconstruction, what we're referring to. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bill that is passed by Lincoln, Sherman Grant, the Republicans, in sort of reconfiguring the Southern economy post Civil War, and really honestly, anything good and worthwhile that has been said about Reconstruction was said by W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, and re-said by Eric Foner, But even Eric Foner will say, I'm just retelling you what Du Bois already said, right? He is the historian that really got what was happening. And what he says is really, it is a clash of capital and labor. And it really becomes about like the redomination of Black men and women through violence, through disenfranchisement. So what it was, you have the Civil War, the grant of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which are equal protection, due process under the law, the right to vote. And those rights exist for about 8 years. And, Black men are actually being, elected to Congress and representing the interests of the race. And there was this recognition by at least some Southerners that this is sort of the new thing. And there's this recession that happens sort of, 7 years hence. And as everyone's growing cotton, the prices come down. Of course, that's what happens if everyone's in this, debt market, and really kind of puts pressure, and that Reconstruction gets sort of radically overthrown by the Southern Democrats through violence, through complete disenfranchisement, through the overtaking of the courts and the lawyers and all the laws that they remade to reinforce that labor. So you couldn't be a vagrant, which meant you couldn't not be growing cotton. And if you were sold into convict leasing and then you were, consigned to, for the rest of your life, be in the steel sort of mines, no due process. And then there was the Black codes where you couldn't actually have any trade to take to property. Your property wasn't protected, where you couldn't get patents for your inventions. All of those rights that were earned by the freedmen were slowly taken away. And all of that sort of was complete by, within 10 years. And after 10 years, there's a rebirth of real sort of, the Klan is way post slavery, way post Reconstruction, the Jim Crow economy, all of that stuff is sort of just like this retrenched white supremacy that is well past all of that.
Right. So in that period of time, it's interesting because really most white people in the country didn't have property, right? There were like a few landed white men who were very wealthy, but the vast majority of the population was not well off. There was no social security. People were dying in poverty. Obviously, if you were a slave, that was a whole different situation, but still there was incredible poverty. So you move up and you get this explosion. So I'm now moving us forward in your story, right? So you get this real increase in a white middle class and more economic opportunity. So can you tell us how that happened and how the role race played in these more modern kind of events?
Yeah, so there's this whole progressive tradition of a complete revision to the structures that we had. So this starts under Wilson, and this is the sort of tragedy of American progressivism. And it didn't have to be this way, but the second you actually get a people's movement to challenge the monopolies and the trusts and the big money powers, it is also deeply infused with white supremacy. So it is the Southern Democrats, it is Wilson who push a lot of these progressive reforms. And so there's that story, but I'll just skip to the New Deal, right? The New Deal, I mean, FDR, it wasn't like Wilson, he wasn't a white supremacist like Wilson, but to get the New Deal passed, he had to, give the Southern Democrats what they wanted. And he essentially ends up kind of cementing racial segregation in housing in the law. So what happens between 1934 and 1935 is that the entire banking sector, credit, mortgages, everything is completely radically changed. As you said, not only did people not have property generally, I mean, the Homestead Acts do give some land grants, but people don't have property. There's no mortgages. Most mortgages are like a 5-year, you have to pay half the price, so not really available. So what FDR does during the New Deal is takes out the risk in all mortgage lending and all banking. So FDIC insurance is created at that moment. All deposits are insured. The FHA guarantees every mortgage loan as long as they are, a certain like loan to value ratio, 30-year fixed rate, capped on interest, and in an area that the FHA deems not super high risk. And how do they determine this? Purely on race. So you have these HOLC map makers, and you can actually look at these original maps. There's this great website called Mapping Inequality, where you can go to any neighborhood and dig up the actual 1934 HOLC map. And if you look at any neighborhood that's redlined, essentially in the first sort of subsection, it'll say race of inhabitants. So it'll be like, Mexican or subversive races, and then Black. And if it was Black over a certain proportion, or if it's over too Mexican or whatever, then it would be redlined. And so you could not get a loan, you could not get a mortgage in that time. And that ends up applying also to really high net worth Black communities, even at the time that these were the sort of elite in Atlanta, in Chicago. There are some landowning properties, and even those are sort of eradicated because you don't have a market anymore. So what this does is it embeds not just the sort of, creates this white wealth building suburb. The Black spaces are now tenant. It sucks the wealth out, actually, because now you're paying more in rent than you would be paying in the suburbs. And it also links up all sorts of, schools and taxes and parks and all of that stuff into the home ownership, and really cements racial segregation. And then there's the law that kind of perpetuates it, right? So every community has a racial covenant. Every community has an HOA or it's malpractice for real estate agents to build too close to the Black community, right? There's FHA manuals to real estate agents saying you're too close, you have to build a wall, or you have to make sure you segregate. And it really embeds property values with racism.
And I'm curious, have you looked at the property values now? Like how tightly correlated are they with those original shifts in property values is a function of the FHA support?
Yeah. So the studies are still that Black properties in Black neighborhoods don't increase in value still. What is a Black neighborhood? It's somewhere between 5 to 10% of homes turn to Black. As far as, are they still in the red lined areas? Those have shifted a bit. So, there's this resegregation phenomenon. So Ferguson, Missouri is an example where St. Louis was heavily segregated and all of the redlined areas were, Black inner city. And then as it resegregates, as it, gentrifies, the Black community is pushed out because they hadn't been able to own the equity under the land. So this has happened in New York and Chicago, a few other places. But besides that, you can roughly track the complete history of the country, and every zip code now lines back up with those 1934 maps. And you can look not just at wealth, but at economic mobility. You can look at school resources. You can track literally anything to zip code, and it will be a stand-in for race, to such an extent that credit cards and other sort of credit scores can't use zip code because that's considered discriminatory. And because we are so geographically segregated still.
And so where do Black banks come into all this? So you started off looking at Black banks. Yeah. So now we haven't really talked about them yet. So where do Black banks start to come into this?
Yeah, so Black banks become this sort of stand-in by, so there's a reason why Black banks are created by Black communities themselves. Like you've got heavy Jim Crow segregation, white institutions refuse to lend, to take deposits, to do anything with Black customers, especially in the Jim Crow South, but also increasingly in the North. And so a lot of these institutions, most of them are created out of need because you need a place to do all of it. It's not just Black banks, it's burial societies and social clubs and schools and all this other stuff. At one point though, and kind of throughout, the sort of Black banks start becoming the place where the promise of sort of closing the racial wealth gap or equality starts to be kind of imposed on Black banks. And this is very much like an outside phenomenon. A lot of the Black bankers themselves, a lot of the Black leaders were sort of pushing toward policy and politics, except for people like Booker T. Washington and others who said, look, if we gain economic strength and economic power, that political power will come. And so what I do is I look at the Black banks and look at the money creating mechanism and whether you can create wealth, either individually or for the community through a Black bank. Can you, as Black banks, the industry promises, control the Black dollar or keep it in a community? And what I show is not only are their deposits suck money out of the banks because they're small and they're volatile and they're very risky, but the equity, banks make money by your loans. So the bank assets are liability. So a mortgage is a bank asset. That's how they make money. And Black mortgages on Black homes were underwater almost as soon as they were issued because of the segregation economics. And then as far as like the moneymaker, as Black banks lend, the Black banks could take deposits from Black communities and lend into Black communities, but that money quickly escaped because of the original status quo of white property ownership and Black tenants. And this was early on, but as it changes, after the New Deal, there's only 5 Black banks that are able to survive from 1934 until the 60s, because it's impossible to get private capital or any capital for a mortgage if you're not part of this FHA program. And then during the civil rights movement, there's like a resurgence of Black banks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, like both versions of the, both kind of different philosophies of the civil rights movement push for Black banking for different reasons. And then, I track sort of Nixon then coming in and co-opting the language of Black banking and Black business to reinforce segregation. So no integration, you can have your Black banks and just create that economy while maintaining segregation without any capital. And so that is a subversion. And the reason why that pivot is important is because we're still living it. Opportunity zones, all of the bank policy, everything that we do as banking attorneys and law professors to promote equity is embedded in this Nixonian structure of small banks, community banks. The premise is always that, for poor communities, the way that they're going to gain wealth is to create their own banking institutions. And that was the original myth I tried to debunk, because it's not true.
So
and they know it. Yeah.
we've been duped, because it's, you get support from all quarters for this sort of community empowerment, because at the time there wasn't really, segregation didn't allow you to participate in the full economy, right? The broader economy, if you were Black. So this was what was left to you. And so basically you're saying that was always a dead end. Is that right?
Yes. And I'm, I will say that the people who didn't buy it, there were, two Black economists who studied this, the only two economists in the country who actually studied whether this would work. And they both essentially, one is Abram Harris in 1936, and he looks at all the balance sheets of all the Black banks. He's a first Black economist at Chicago. He's sort of written out of the Chicago econ story. He's like this brilliant economist, and he writes this book called Negro as Capitalist in 1936, and basically says this: look, all this money is leaking out of the banks. They cannot hold it, so stop with this, right? And when Carter Woodson writes The Miseducation of the Negro, he writes, all these very educated, professors who say we can't do this. He's hitting on Abram Harris, I think. And then Andrew Brimmer, after Nixon's Black Capitalism program, Andrew Brimmer is the first Black Federal Reserve board member, appointed by Johnson, and son of a sharecropper, like Harvard educated economist, a brilliant guy. He goes to Congress and he says, this Black capitalism is snake oil. Don't buy this, because there's a trap. And the trap is that you can't have capitalism without capital. And what they're trying to do is, without the subsidies, right? The state economy, and those state guarantees that the New Deal does, billions of dollars are guaranteed to create mortgage loans. And that private capital comes in and sends all that money into the white suburbs. And now we're saying, okay, well, you use capitalism. And Brimmer says that's not how it works. It's not going to work without actual capital. You can't create money out of nothing. And so so he goes, and he's drowned out, obviously, because it's an appealing narrative. It's very much the bootstraps, George Bailey community bank. It makes people feel good. There's this like community banking myth, and that precedes Nixon. That is like a very Jeffersonian tradition. And it's the one that I debunk. Quite frankly, my first book, I go at the Jeffersonian tradition, like holistically, because we're still living in this myth that these small community banks and credit unions, like that's the answer to inequality, where all banking is national, all banking is federal. The Fed can create trillions of dollars overnight, and you're telling these communities to put their money together to make like these tiny loans. That's not going to work.
So you're saying the white middle class was created by the government through all these basically loan guarantees that produced the economy that the Black folks were shut out of, and they were asked to do it on their own. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. So here's okay. So here's a question. I'm gonna assert, and you can challenge me on this. There's been some progress, right? How do you account for that? Like the progress that's been made by the Black community, what do you attribute that to?
Oh yeah, that's of course there's progress. Of course, there's progress in, the civil rights laws were the, like taking serious the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. There's less like overt racism. There hasn't been progress on the racial wealth gap by numbers. Home ownership rates, Black versus white, are as dramatic now as they were in the 1880s. The wealth gap has barely budged. So if you're looking at means, if you're looking at medians, those numbers haven't budged. So it's easy to find like the numbers like Oprah and LeBron James, and there's certainly successful people, but numbers work through the mean. And truly, I mean, white poverty is also a problem. I mean, inequality is a massive problem. So I think we may get to a point where it's not specifically race-based, right? But because race and class have been so intertwined, it still is very much the case that certain communities are going to be disinvested. And that's increasingly white communities are also in that boat, but it's not because they're white. It is just a phenomenon.
So you're a lawyer, so I assume you're aware of Derek Bell's interest convergence hypothesis. Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about what that means in a second, but I have a few things there. So I'll just say briefly in my rendition of it, and then you can correct me from an expert's perspective. It's more or less when people have power and the dominant group have power, control, political or monetary, they only help the groups that are disenfranchised, are economically poor, when it serves their interest to do so. Is that a fair rendition of it?
Yeah. That's how I understand it. And I, yeah. Do you want me to?
Yeah, so let me go a little bit further, because I think there's a larger question I want to ask here, which is policy, public policy and economic policy are, and obviously I'm making a false distinction here, but work with me for a second, because you talked about the Civil Rights Act, you talked about the Voting Rights Act, but those things don't end up having a huge consequence on the wealth gap, as you pointed out. And I'm curious about that disjunction, that separation, because most of the time in the book, you're talking about how these things work hand in glove, right? How these, the politics, the shutting out of opportunities in terms of segregation, for example, or Jim Crow laws are driving these economic outcomes because they don't have access to the capital, they don't have access to markets. But you see there's, and I'm wondering how you think about this. You see this improvement, in bursts and fits. Obviously, it's often walked back, but you see these improvements, but you don't see the same improvement on the economic side, right? So you see a pulling back of Jim Crow laws, but you don't see a huge advance in wealth creation. What do you make of that, or what should I make of that?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot in there. So one is like on the interest convergence theory, and one of the things I think that in the civil rights story most kind of speaks to Derek Bell's idea is this Cold War, background to civil rights. I mean, it's not that people hadn't been demanding civil rights forever. I mean, since slavery, like there has been a resistance movement always, and the question is when does it become part of the convergence of white interests? And I don't think that that's necessarily a super pessimistic look at it. We have a majoritarian democracy, and insofar as we have race delineated ourselves, right, and insofar as what's good for some race is not good for all of us, then you're not going to get anything that benefits minorities. This is post sort of being even getting the right to vote. So the Cold War, the push there is that you have the State Department writing like the communist. So just interlacing that history of the Cold War, you have the communists using lynching as propaganda. You have this real, if you think about like Frantz Fanon's, 1960s, like, look, the colonies are done with exploitation and empire, and we are increasingly going to take up arms. So, the Wretched of the Earth is very much a call to arms across the world. So it gets translated into, Farsi and Chinese, and it's all over Africa and the Algerian, resistant movement. And it's, of course, comes to America, right? There is this cross anti-colonial movement. And a lot of the Black power groups, I think they've been actually misinterpreted. I didn't go too much into this, but there is a pan anti-colonialist movement happening here too, where people like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey earlier is really linking up the Black exploitation and the Black ghetto to colonization, right? It's like we are a colony inside this nation. And the same way that colonies are exploited, but also kind of like, patronized, that is what's happening here. And so I think this convergence really pushes, on both sides. I think one is it behooves the American empire, as it's trying to fight these communists abroad, to actually franchise its own, Black Americans, especially as they're coming back from this, fight abroad. On the one hand. On the other hand, that's when sort of the neoliberal idea of the government shouldn't do anything really starts to pick up, right? So there's, a lot of these, Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, and this was the surprising thing that I, ended up, I guess, being more cynically surprised by, is how integral those thinkers, Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan specifically, were in the Nixon administration to craft his Black capitalism program. And they were saying things like, look, there was like this unrest in these Black spaces, saying like, we want sovereignty, we want capital, we want justice, as this was happening across the world. And you have Greenspan, advising Nixon, look, this is anti-capitalist. You should just label them communists and call them enemies of capitalism. And really, capitalism becomes this weapon against these interests. And so I actually don't think, as you said, I don't think it is that there isn't progress. I think what happens at that moment and then into the 70s is neoliberalism actually stops the sort of subsidies that existed up until that moment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it coincides with the Black justice movement. I don't think it was the only thing, but I think if you link it up with all the anti-colonial fights abroad, I think it is a tool of empire, and not like a cabal or a conspiracy, but the idea that allows people in power to remain in power without having to, integrate or pay reparations.
Mm-hmm. So the reason I brought up the interest convergence, so typically it's used to talk in terms of foreign policy. Then as you pointed out, like during the Cold War, how do you fight communism if they're using this propaganda of the way you're treating minorities, in particular black people in this country? How do you deal with that? And the idea that is in large part what drove desegregation, that I think is the case that's normally used to describe that. I was thinking more in terms of the unrest, right? So it's never in the interest of the people in power to allow unrest to persist in society, because they suffer most in terms of the undermining the productivity of society if they're extracting the most benefit. And so it's normally not talked about that way, but I'm curious because at one point you seem to suggest that Black capitalism was a way to drain the power from like the Black power movement or the demands that were being made. And you seem to suggest that was a way to push back against progress that was being made. So then would you suggest that people should have continued to be in the streets, that there should have been more demands and more unrest? I'm curious about how you think that could have played out in a more positive way.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm with like Martin Luther King, his like very sophisticated response to the protests of violent movements is that like, you're outgunned, you're outnumbered. That was never going to work just by sheer numbers. Like you fight the American military and you're going to get squashed. Every colonial movement found that out, except for the ones that were able to do like guerrilla resistance, right? So Vietnam was like a infamous, embarrassment for the American military, but it was never going to work here, just practically speaking. And I'm not saying that should have been continued. I do think, it wasn't just Black capitalism. It wasn't a rhetorical crushing of the Black power movement. It was also the FBI. I mean, the FBI either exiled or killed or infiltrated every resistance group in the country. But like, the Black Panthers were nothing short of an actual resistance to the federal government. And of course, those things are really marginalized now. And the story has really been told by not them. And I think there was a moment where it could have gone differently. And I do think that, not that the violence was going to lead there, but more of a coalition building. And I think this is where you go back to Reconstruction. There was a moment during Reconstruction where there was starting to be a coalition of white sharecroppers and Black sharecroppers. And what's used to cut that is white supremacy by the Democrat Party. So the populists were going to create a Southern sharecropping movement against the oligarchs. And I think that looks to be happening again. The Black Panthers were forming up with the white Appalachian like movements, and it was never going to be like, it hadn't had the opportunity yet to be cross racial, but Martin Luther King was getting there. Malcolm X had already, they were already doing a poor people's movement. And so I think there were potential coalitions that got subverted by Black capitalism, not just by Black capitalism though. There was a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Labor got crushed, any sort of public programming, Great Society stuff, all of that. And then the weaponization of welfare, that was Reagan and started in Nixon. All of that cut down the potential coalitions. And we're seeing it now with Trump, right? I mean, it is very much a Nixonian playbook, right?
I was going to ask you that, like, so when you just described that, you could be talking about today, right? Yeah. I mean, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement is, by many accounts, the biggest movement in American history. It's incredibly diverse in terms of the people that have been participating. And so you said you were cynical. Are you hopeful then now about this? Yeah. Or what do you think how would you connect what's happening now to what you've learned in your studies?
Yeah, I'll be as hopeful as I can be. I'm not cynical, but I am careful. Like, so here's the thing. Forget, like, again, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but if you're JP Morgan, or if you're a big institutional power, if you're a monopoly, right? You want to maintain power. All powerful people, capital, if you look at it from the views of power and capital, you just want to maintain your power. No one's going to just give that up, right? It doesn't have to be race-based power, right? So you would much rather, I think, deal with racism than give up your power. So that's what it takes. Then maybe we get there. The New Deal, before the New Deal, Italians and Irish people were not white, and they were also segregated. And the New Deal sort of brought them into the American system. So I do think whiteness is expanding, but there's still power in whiteness. And I think before it encompasses the entire Black community, because it has been set as anti-Blackness, it will take in some other groups. And so I think one is that whiteness will expand, and the other is that a lot of the companies and some of the powerful sort of groups and institutions will diversify and give voice to Black Lives Matter before the structures of power will shift. So that the hopeful thing though is that it's a moment of adaptation. Like, I do think that this is another pivot point. There's the Reconstruction movement, the civil rights movement, and we're at another one. It's not just Black Lives Matter, it is Black Lives Matter, but it's also, the Trump phenomenon and the radical racism. Like, when I was finishing this book, I was writing an ending that was, okay, now that we're in a colorblind America, how does racism present itself now that it can't be out loud? And I had to revise that last bit because it actually has been out loud again. There is this real backlash to Obama and Black progress. But I think that has actually pushed the conversation further. So all of that to say, yeah, I do think that we're at a moment of change. And yes, I think the incentives are there for an evolution of that hierarchy as opposed to a complete eradication.
Got it. So I'm a psychologist by training. I don't know if I told you that already, but I find it amazing, given that I know a bit of this history, that the ideas have been as compelling as they are. The idea of like pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, of capitalism and free markets, given the history of wealth generation in this country, just clearly does not track that. That's one. And two, that we don't behave in a way consistent with the meritocracy in the terms of the way we raise our kids, and the idea of looking forward, giving them advantages clearly over others. So that the idea that psychology persists is really interesting to me. But even though I'm a psychologist, I tend to think that what you should change is not the psychology, but the policies, right? So that you should start with that, what's on the ground, and then assume that will affect the psychology. So, and given what you study, like what should we change on the ground? What's possible? Like what could happen that could really change the course of this country's history?
I mean, you either have to eliminate, I mean, you either integrate, and this is an old word, but every kid gets the same resources as every other kid. There isn't this neighborhood. And I agree with you. I think it is all about like, within one generation, I think you can completely change a mindset of people. And I think what it takes is, that proximity and not kind of breaking up race and class the way we do, such that there's such a fear of sort of the bad neighborhoods and the bad schools. And that's how, the privilege reinforces itself, is in that separation, is in the, maybe it's not even the suburbs anymore, but it certainly is. People with privileges shield their kids from the drop to the bottom. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the drop is so high. And I think this applies to any race group, but especially for Black communities. It's just, it's either the difference of going to a school that has resources and parks and sports clubs versus being in an over-policed neighborhood with the trauma of just violence and being exposed not just to police violence, but to, peer violence because of, the sort of over-criminalization of what you see. And I think those things can be easily disrupted through policy. Again, going back to the FHA, the New Deal, the silver lining of that is it took not very much time. It took, 10 years to create an entire suburb, an entire economy where, in 1933, you're paying, $50 in rent in a tenement in Manhattan. And in 1950, those same people, it's not like they gave loans to the middle class, they created a middle class by giving them loans. And so you're Italian, you're Irish, and you're tenement housing segregated in one decade, and the next decade you're, in the white suburb, your kids are going to school, you have the bowling alleys and the great American dream. And your home is building in equity. You've got the GI Bill, you have all of the sort of, the social capital that is being built up in those areas. And in the reverse, all of that stuff is being taken out of of the Black spaces. And so that needs to be disrupted. So it's either you eliminate those disparities that are race-based, so integration, which was what, one group of the civil rights movement was saying. The other is capital. So you flood in capital into those cities. And this is the anti-colonization approach, is you actually create not a gap, right, between the Black spaces and the others, and that's reparations. And I think one or the other, those are the two policy choices, and either one is going to require capital.
Are there really two policy choices?
There are more. No, but then two at the
I think there's
time.
only one.
Okay.
I think there's only one.
Okay.
Here's what I'm gonna. Okay. So tell me, I could be wrong, but tell me why you think I'm wrong here. It's hard to imagine integration functioning if people have this perception of African Americans being scary, crime prone, not respecting what property, whatever these stereotypes are. But those stereotypes are born of lack of resources.
Absolutely.
Right. And so to sound, I mean, this, I guess I'm reading your book, it sounds like to get to successful integration, and I wonder if you think this is true. When I read your book, it sounds like to get to successful integration, you need reparations.
Yes. Yeah. And so when I say integrations, I don't mean it like without capital. Either way, it's got to take capital. It has to be money. And so we could put the money into housing grants, like the Homestead Act, like the FHA. It does, you can call it reparations, you don't have to, but that's one way to do it, is to do the same thing, the same subsidies, the same capital creation for Black communities. And that brings us up to equal, right? And so does reparations. It's just to get to the same place where white Americans have been. And that's where I think just even looking at the outcome of the racial wealth gap to eliminate it, what does that take? And forget any of the other programs, just focus on capital and you can get everything else fixed.
Yeah, that sounds like a pipe dream to me. So in this country, is that it just doesn't, it's hard to imagine the political viability. I know that right now it's actually, it seems as possible as maybe it's been since Reconstruction right now, the way people are talking, and the diversity of the movement around Black Lives Matter. But I'm wondering if this country's, the version of capitalism we have in this country, can it exist without another, without the other, without someone who is not you, not a part of it? Is it possible to have a fully integrated capitalist system in this country?
Let me say this. I mean, the debate between, capitalism or not capitalism versus socialism, we don't have a capitalist economy. We have a state-managed credit / debt / housing system. We have, everything is government either guaranteed or just produced. All of the money comes from the Fed. It gets routed to the banks. The debts are guaranteed by the Treasury. The deposits are guaranteed by the Treasury. It's all state managed. There is no, like, capitalism is an interesting theory, and we can debate what that works. But yes, your question to, can we have American capitalism, whatever that is, without the other? We haven't had it yet. That doesn't mean that we can't have it. I think, the W. Du Bois, so I end with him, he says the only problem with American democracy is that it hasn't been tried. And I think that's the point, is actually, it is now a threat to democracy. The inequality is not just race-based. It is, the majority of Americans are suffering. And you see markets, I mean, really, like the lines, the market is so disassociated from average Americans. I mean, the market keeps ticking up, but only 20% of Americans are in the market, in the stock market. 10% of Americans own 80 to 90% of all the assets. And so we do have a majority of voters who ideally in a democracy could have it differently, could do massive change. And that, again, going to the New Deal, that is what happened. The New Deal was pretty radical, but the threat that FDR was facing was socialism, was, an external threat, an internal threat. Like, he was trying to save the economy from this existential thing. And we may be there. I mean, really, like, the status quo isn't working. And so we could do another New Deal, and this time really include people. And the New Deal worked for the people for whom it was designed to work. It worked. It cut inequality dramatically from the robber baron era until the 70s. So, I do want to leave some hope on the table, because what else can we do,
I hear you. So I'm at a business school. So, and many of our listeners are at a business school. What would you, staying with hope, what would you tell them? Like, they're going to be future leaders of organizations. They're starting organizations. They'll, be managing many, many people. What would you tell them to do if they care about these issues?
Oh gosh, I mean, like every company, when I talk to companies, I said, look in your own backyard and the thing that you do, the industry that you're in. There's so much history within that industry that can be, at least evaluated by each company. So if you're in credit banking, there's this legacy of using credit scores to discriminate, and really thinking hard about how to eliminate these histories. But it really starts with, unless you understand the facts of how the racial wealth gap occurred, how racial inequality happened, you're going to come up with another story. And usually that story is racist. Okay, so if you don't actually understand the history and the legacy of these things, then you're going to just go to, oh, well, some people don't work as hard as others, and maybe it's a biological thing. And you see these theories regurgitated, and there's no scientific basis to them. But I think they're a way out of the sort of mental dissonance. And so I think for business leaders to just get educated, and learn the stuff. If you don't replace it with like bad knowledge, because that ends up self-perpetuating. I mean, I think you see that, I don't know, happening more now, and it's really disheartening.
Mhm. And what would you tell the average white person, right? So when we talk about closing the gap, on one hand, you can say, look, we're not talking about taking anything away from people who are doing fine. We're talking about lifting people who've been systematically shut out of the economy. But let's be honest, it's not going to feel that way, right? And this has been the rhetoric that's been around for a long time, like anti-handouts, welfare, my hard-earned tax dollars paying for someone else. What would you tell the average white person who sees it that way?
Yeah, so I would say this is not the reason to do this, but having the racial wealth gap is a drag on the economy. The New Deal, the public works programs, the investment in getting people out of poverty actually boosted the actual economy. So even if you care about just the bottom line, this is good to eliminate the racial wealth gap, to eliminate just like the America's original sin. It's just healing. Like, forget the justice owed to the Black community. I mean, it's still here with us. Like this myth of race that we created to justify this horrific system of slavery that we don't have anymore and that we have long denounced, but those myths just lingered and stayed and festered because we never really dealt with them. And I think a process of reparations, of truth and reconciliation would be very healing for all of us. I mean, look at post-Nazi Germany. And the way that they are so open about the horrors that happened. And I think Americans just we just want to forget about it and put it aside and kind of go with like, oh, individual color blindness and whatever. And there were these horrific things, and it's okay to say, this was a horrible thing. And let's just put it out there, deal with it, and pay what's owed.
All right, I'd buy that. I'm not the audience, but I guess I'd buy that. Is there anything in closing that you'd like to say? Anything that you haven't told us that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I mean, I think W. Du Bois, between W. Du Bois and James Baldwin, they've really gotten to the sort of mythologies of race. And I think it's helpful for every person who's not soaked in this stuff. And as I was a banking person, but to really kind of go to the original sources and to hear, to read Black Reconstruction is a really just great experience that everyone should do. The Soul of Black Folk, or all the whole James Baldwin nonfiction canon, just to hear it, like, it's very relevant right now.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So thank you all for joining. And next week's session will be on change. So we'll talk with Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder and CEO of PolicyLink. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.